record button. I don't want to forget to do that. All right, so this session is being recorded. Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending today's event entitled Panel Discussion, a chance to talk to contributors from the ECAR Service Ownership and Change Management papers. The format for today's event will consist of, we'll ask the panel of 5 questions. After each panelist has had an opportunity to answer the question, or after that moment of awkward silence, we'll move on to the next question. There will be time left over at the end for Q&A. You can type in your questions anytime using the Q&A feature. A recording of the session will be available on the EDUCAUSE ITSM Google website within 5 business days. Everyone will be on mute. Feel free to use the chat window to talk to each other, but please use the Q&A feature to ask questions. Be sure to include your name and your institution so we know where you're hailing from. All right, these are the objectives for today's conversation. Without further ado, I want to introduce our panelists. We are pleased to welcome the panelists. I want to thank them for being here today. A reminder that the panelists' contact information is in the slide deck, which will be available in the recording. I want to introduce, first we have the folks representing the Service Ownership Group. We've got Michael Sire. He's the Director, Architecture and Service Management at the University of Maine. Next we have Lisa Pegg. She's a Business Analyst at the University of Washington. Next we have Chaz Grundy. He's the Manager of Product Services at University of Notre Dame. Megan wasn't able to be here with us today, so Chaz so kindly jumped in. So thank you, Chaz, for jumping in there. Next, we have representing the Change Management Working Group, we have Beth Rugg. She's the Assistant Vice Chancellor, Client Engagement, University of North Carolina, Charlotte. Next, we have Barbara Trainer. She's IT Manager, Engagement and Consulting Services at Arizona State University. And finally, we have Craig Bennon, IT Process Manager, University of Utah. Hope I didn't slaughter anybody's name too bad, but we have those 6 joining us today, and I thank you for taking time out to give this presentation. So without further ado, we'll start the presentation. We'll start with the first question. We're going to allocate about 5 minutes or so for each question to allow panelists to have an opportunity to answer the question, and then to also be able to give us time at the end for Q&A. So we'll start with the first question. Barbara, how and what did you decide to include and not to include? You're on mute, Barbara.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no, that's fine.
Yeah, so the interesting thing about that was it was more difficult to determine what not to include in the paper than it was to decide what we should include. What to include flowed a little bit like a waterfall in abundance. We had a team whose combined experience was probably in the hundreds of years, and they had a wealth of knowledge and information and documentation, and they were all very passionate for our topic, change management. We spent, in the beginning, we spent many of the meetings, discussing what people did, what each of our universities did, how, and learning about the different nuances that certain groups had. We considered all of the, we also considered all of the other processes that interact with change management. So we could have literally have written hundreds of pages into this white paper. So faced with that large amount of data, and understanding that most people probably wouldn't want to read hundreds of pages of documentation, we considered our audience and focused back to the goal of making it a practical guide, and knowing that our audience would probably be people who were trying to start up change management or looking for simple ways to improve change management. So we identified that the practices that were most common amongst all of our universities, and thought that that's what we needed to document in this white paper. we considered what were our pain points when we started up and what were our challenges, and we tried to include as many of those as we could. When it came to special practices for unique environments, we chose to leave most of those out, although some of them felt like we needed a special mention to those. But if we try to cover the 80% and leave the 20% of outliers out of the paper. We also chose not to include any of the processes that touch change management, because there were so many of them, and we wanted to keep our paper very focused on our goal.
Okay, thank you. How about anyone representing the service ownership side? Did you also have things you decided to include or not to include? And by the way, I apologize. I see Chaz is not here yet. Maybe he'll jump on later, but I just wanted to mention that.
Hi, this is Lisa Pegg, and I was on the service owner and manager working group. Yeah, I think I'd like to second the notion that deciding what to keep out is actually can be really challenging, because you start to have bleed from one topic into another. And an example in ours would be kind of this notion of product owner. Like, what's the responsibility of a product owner, which is starting to emerge more as a focus, as opposed to a service owner. And we really did need to make put a hard line in the sand to actually keep that out of the discussion, because it's such a large thing, it could derail. So when you're looking at what to keep in and keep out, part of that should be driven, by how much are you going to blur the lines if you're bringing something in that's not the true focus of that. And then I think also understanding other collateral that's out there, other working papers that are out there, and simply being able to reference those, like the service catalog one, is also important when you're pulling these together.
Great, thank you. This next question was a fan favorite when we asked people what questions we should ask the panelists. What was a source or sources of vigorous debate? And I think Barbara, is your turn to take this first question, or answer this question first.
Yeah, well, we certainly did have some vigorous debates, and luckily our team was always very respectful of everyone's opinions and tried to listen and understand. I think it was educational for us to discover some of the differences that we did have. They could definitely, our debates definitely could be vigorous, yet they were sort of fun and informative and eye-opening. One particular debate that comes to mind was who participates in the Change Advisory Board. So some of the universities felt very strongly that the executive leadership belonged on that Change Advisory Board, yet some others thought, yeah, there's no way that they should be there because they would influence the decisions adversely. So in the end, we still always seem to land on, what do 80% of us do, and mention some of the nuances that we thought other people might also experience. Another area of frequent debate that I can think of was whether to include some of the other best practices, such as ITIL, which were broader than what most of us actually do. And upon that, we did go back to, what's our goal, what's our focus, what's our audience? Our audience for the paper was, the people starting up and wanting to make improvements.
Mitch, and if I can just jump in, I worked very closely with Barb on this paper as well. Barb, do you remember the discussion we had about at what point should the change management process be invoked? Because I think at a very ideal level, we would love to see the idea of change management being invoked at the very beginning of any kind of new idea, change, or upgrade or initiative. And yet so often the reality of it is it becomes invoked right at the point something's going into production. So I think we acknowledge that in the paper, and we would all agree we'd love to see it happen sooner rather than later, but ultimately any change management is better than nothing.
Yeah, yes, we were talking about the dream world versus the real world.
It's my pleasure to mention that Chaz is with us now. Hey, Chaz.
Hi, I'm sorry. I've been on for half an hour. I've been on for the last half an hour as an attendee, trying to get somebody's attention to figure out how do I join as a panelist. So I'm so sorry.
No, I'm glad you're here, and I hope your son did well in the spelling bee.
Third place in the county.
Nice.
So
all right, congrats. We were only in on the second question. Did you want to add anything about? Were there any vigorous debates or topics that you vigorously debated?
Yeah, the biggest thing that I remember from early on was trying to define the scope. We for service ownership, we went in saying we just need a definition, and we immediately realized that falls well short of thoroughly useful for anybody. So a definition is just the first step. We needed to provide context and all this other. We also had a laundry list of ideas of other things we wanted to make, tools, frameworks, processes that just were well outside the scope of what we could do in a paper like this. So we said, let's ask the community, especially our ITSM group and the other folks doing this, to start making things and share it with the community. And so this was kind of a first salvo. Hey, let's define a little bit and start to cast a vision. Let's hope that the momentum continues. And so we've seen a little bit of that come out, and I look forward to seeing a lot more.
This is Mike, and I wanted to add that I was on the service ownership group, and something, it wasn't really a source of debate, but something that took a lot of work that may not look like it is the chart we developed. I think it's on page 7, that shows the roles of the service owner and service offering manager through service lifecycle, and looks pretty straightforward. And my memory is that it took a lot. It was a lot of time to get that tight and succinct, and also visually, so it made sense, and something that's not as maybe obvious in looking at it, how much effort went into that.
Anybody else have an additional thought before I move on to question 3?
Mitch, it's Beth. I would just say that on the change management paper, we had also vigorous debate on our RACI chart. It just took a while to really get consensus as to who's responsible, accountable, or just informed. So that's an interesting experience. I think it's helpful when you're writing the paper, but it's actually quite difficult to come to consensus on that.
Very good points. This next question, for those of you attending that have desired to be in a working group and didn't really necessarily know what the process was like or what was actually involved, this question I think helps to address this. So can you describe the creative process? And we'll start with Craig on this one.
Sure. So I guess part of the creative process actually started prior to forming the group, where ECAR had been getting questions about change management, and based on those questions, they put an outline together. And then we use that outline as the basis to kind of direct our paper. And as Beth and Barb mentioned, we really focused on, who's our audience, who's most likely going to be looking at this information, and kind of establishing a focus. What are some things that we wish we knew when we first started our change process? I think the other aspect too is the makeup of our group. We had research universities, public, private universities, art colleges. So we really had a broad community that were participating in the overall process. And so that brought a lot of diversity to our group. And then what we chose to do is, with the topic list that we we kind of broke down into individual teams, and then each team would author a section based on that topic, and then we would get back together. So as Barb mentioned, one of the first things we did is we kind of did an internal literature survey of what our processes and what do we think our best practices are, and then we kind of evolved things from there. I think as we went through the process, we were able to refine things, and that refining actually took a lot of work, as Michael pointed out. Trying to decide, what really are those essential things that people need to know. So that's from my perspective. Overall, there was a lot of vigorous debate on certain aspects, but for us, being on the change committee, it was very collegial and very informative for everybody, I think. So, anybody else have something to add to that?
Craig, I was just going to say, working with you, I find the creative process wonderful and hard at the same time. It's like any group project, right? Where when the team first comes together, you're kind of forming, storming, norming, and then ultimately you get performing. And for us, I think it happened in a fairly quick amount of time, right? I think as a group,
Yes.
we probably worked about 6 months on it, but I think it was helpful because there was a pretty, the goal, the scope was pretty specific from the get-go, so then we could more or less easily start breaking into small groups and start doing the work. But it's one of those things I found I loved it and I hated it at the same time. I was glad for the experience, but always wondering, should I say this? Because our process was not necessarily normal. I mean, we have a lot of, we've deviated greatly from some of the EIDL processes, but it was still a very interesting and exciting process to be involved in. And of course, great to get to know others in our community.
So I'm going to interject real quick. Anne is asking, what types of questions or feedback have you received since publication?
This is Beth. I know for our change management paper, we did have the opportunity to present at the EDUCAUSE conference, and we received just many questions there during that meeting. I think what's always interesting, we very consciously wanted to make the paper very applicable so that anybody could just take some of the ideas in there and start getting change management up and running. So it was a very practical approach to change management. So I think that's a lot of the questions. It's more about the how and the tactics and the who. The why was pretty established, right? There's a pretty strong conceptual framework within ITSM and EIDL, but just exactly how do you get going? So those are some of the questions we received.
Yeah, as we stood at the presentation, wondering if anybody would show up, and the room started to fill with probably over 100 people. It became apparent that it was very important to people, and we did it in an interactive way such that they could participate and share their ideas too. So that was a good experience for us as well.
And that was at 8 a.m. on Friday.
That's right.
Well, that's a great question, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to have this panel discussion, is to allow people that read the papers to ask some in-depth questions and have a chance to really pick the author's brains and ask things that maybe weren't included in the paper, which is a great segue to the fourth question. Litsa, did you or anybody else in the panel or even in the audience, did you make any changes as a result of participating? Did you make any changes in your own world as a result of participating or even reading the paper?
So at the University of Washington, we are in the midst of rewriting our service owner and service manager role descriptions. We've had role descriptions in place, but they are kind of in dire need of a refresh. And, I think like anyone who's looking to use, be it industry norms or standards, industry frameworks, I have to use that document as input to my own work, but it doesn't really replace the work I need to do. So like, for example, we use different terms, some non-standard terms. We have business service owners, service offering owners, and service offering managers. And it makes sense for us. They're well established, so we're not looking to change that, right? So I kind of have to look at what we pulled together from that document and, tailor things a little bit just for our own roles. So I tend to use it more as a checklist to make certain that I have thought about all of the areas that we addressed in the paper, because I do think the team was very thorough in that. And it doesn't necessarily mean that every aspect of the responsibilities in the paper make it way into our role descriptions, but I've at least thought about it. And then really nice is we spent a lot of time on the verbiage, a lot, the joys of being in higher ed. And so I've replaced some of our verbiage with either things directly from that paper or slightly modified versions, because I think we have so many people taking a look at it, and then there was the EDUCAUSE editors, right, that I found that maybe I was saying the same thing substantively, but the EDUCAUSE paper said it more clearly. So that's how I've used it.
This is Mike. I was also on the service owner group, and it was very timely for us. It was a question that we had been wrestling with, and so we were able to implement it right away. It cleared things up, made things a lot clearer for our service. What we ended up switching over to using the term service offering manager, updated our service catalog tool that way, and then also giving us the layout in lifecycle for the breakdown of the roles was very helpful, and will probably will improve the service catalog, service offering review that we're going to get started doing soon. So really, it was very timely for us and helpful. And one of the reasons I actually asked to get on the board was, I was looking for enrichment for ourselves, as well as being able to help work this out.
Anybody else on the panel do anything actionable in their own environment, or?
So this is Craig. One of the things, our change management process we've been doing for several years, but we were always looking at better ways to assess risk and impact of change, and that was one of the topics that was discussed a lot in our group, and based on some of the ideas that came out of that, we were able to incorporate that back into our change process.
So this is Chaz. I was on the service owner paper, and I had told everybody the first meeting that it was actually a project that I had taken on for the years. One of my goals was to help define and launch a service owner kind of initiative, something that was really poorly defined for us at Notre Dame. So I was going in basically trying to spread out all that work, so it wasn't just on me, but it was on a whole bunch of other smart people from other institutions, so that I could just take what their good work was and bring it back to Notre Dame. So instantly, right away, coming back and starting to put it into practice. And in fact, at the EDUCAUSE annual conference, as a pre-conference workshop, working with Todd Jensen, who was on the paper, who's also the kind provider of our webinar today, and Luke Tracy from the University of Michigan, we did a full day pre-conference boot camp about service ownership and service offering management. And so that was the basis of a bunch of training materials, a bunch of tools. We developed new things. We stole and borrowed from our institutions and anything we could find to try to put that together. And I'm actually doing the first of a small series of full-day workshops on our campus for my colleagues this coming Monday. So that's what's been soaking up my time right now, is trying to put into practice exactly the work that all of these nice folks were able to do over the last year. So I'm very grateful for everybody who did that and for being a part of it.
Well, thank you, Chaz. I just want to acknowledge there's some questions coming in through the Q&A, which is great. Let me go back to a question Anne has. She's asking in the chat, what would you say is the most important in terms of helping new service owners understand and act on their responsibilities?
So I could take this one real quick. Just a huge hurdle for people is the terminology. When we say service, even on the panel, we sometimes had to kind of recenter ourselves around the idea that a service is the end-to-end business need and how we meet that. So email is a service, but Gmail is a service offering. And so getting people to understand that their service is bigger than maybe that specific one or two tools that they touch and they manage. Internalizing the language can be a huge first step. And then trying to broaden out what that responsibility is so that it's not just that one or two things that I'm touching, but having to think holistically. So we can certainly share a lot more from what we did back in the pre-conference in terms of a training. Both Nebraska and Michigan had done more of that training before I had gotten to it. So I'll let them offer to share their stuff if they like.
This is Lisa. I think that is what you said is completely true. If you have someone coming into these roles that have never served the roles before, even if the roles are solidly established in your institution, I think you need to look at it like you would any other onboarding process, because there's a lot kind of embedded in that role. So I think organizationally, if you have a service management office, just as an example, or steering committee, something to think about is, what would you want a new service owner to do day one? What are your expectations of them a month in, 2 months in, 6 months in, a year in? Because no one's going to tackle all these things on day one. And if you as an organization kind of thought about that onboarding and what's really important to you, I think that could be a tool as well. Not that we've done that, but I think about it. It's on my to-do list.
Any other final thoughts regarding question 4, or should we jump into the last question? Okay, Beth, this question's for you. What research did you do to prepare you for the paper? So what research did you wind up doing?
Sure. Well, I think Barb already alluded to it. We actually didn't do much research because we think the basic concepts of change management are already well covered in either EIDL or ITSM. So our research was really regarding just what are other institutions doing? How has higher ed implemented these ideas and concepts of change management? We did look, I think, to some research as far as just how do you document some of the terms and definitions and some of the workflows or process charts. But beyond that, most of the research was just sharing what we all do on a daily basis.
Thank you for that response. Kevin is asking a question. Unless anyone else has any thoughts about research they did, maybe on the change management or the service ownership side, was there any research that your group did? Okay, let's jump into some of the questions then. And I remind the audience, the attendees, that go ahead and feel free to type into the Q&A any questions. Let's address, Amit has a couple questions here. Examples of non-standard terms, please. I think he's referring to the change management paper. If you're not, please type in the chat window or restate your question, please. I'll move on to their next question while they're either restating it or maybe it's been answered.
Mitch, I can maybe address a little bit.
Okay.
One thing that comes to mind in the EIDL framework, there's a kind of a standard change and a routine change, and I think those terms are often confusing. So I think some of the institutions had just adjusted that terminology so it was a little bit more clear when they were applying those concepts so that people wouldn't get confused. I remember we also had quite a lot of discussion about emergency changes or out-of-band changes. There seemed to be a fairly wide range of difference on what people called those types of changes and how they were handled from a process standpoint.
You know, and I think in general, from the change perspective, we tried to standardize our terms around the ITIL framework, just so that there was common ground for everybody to work from. But I think those are two really good examples, Beth, where people in common practice talk about things as being routine changes, when in ITIL, you know, we talk about it as being a standard change.
And I actually just glanced at our the actual paper. We actually had some discussion too about informational changes and how they were handled with any given process, right? Because there's certainly changes,
Right.
especially moving to the cloud, where there's changes taking place that we actually, as IT providers, may or may not have much impact over. So how do you handle those types of changes, out-of-cycle changes, and then test changes, right? Are people really documenting their test changes?
Test environment.
Right, and if so, how are those handled?
Yep.
Yeah, Beth, if you recall from the ITIL book, if you've read that, there's really a process in change management for testing your build and approving it, to approving test and then approving the implementation. But I think a lot of us just go right to approving implementation. So
Exactly. Yep. Exactly.
all right. So question that came in through the chat. Let me scroll to find it here, from Kevin McCarthy. He's asking, there seems to be a trend within higher ed products, that is, products seem to be aligned more closely with service offerings, Gmail as a product. Curious if there is anyone that had discussion for the folks on the committee as part of this process.
Yeah, we wanted to align with the ITIL definition of an IT service, which is not product specific, but focused more on the business value and what customers are trying to accomplish. So we also, maybe this goes back to the research question, but we also wanted to stay in alignment with the ECAR service catalog payment paper. Not necessarily, it's not a subsidiary of that, but we wanted to at least align with that, and so that makes that distinction nicely in structurally in the recommendation for service catalog. So and then what ended up happening, I think, is we realized that as we separated out these roles into two entities, that those aligned nicely with those two different structural elements of service and service offering. Would my colleagues agree with that?
Yes. Yeah. We talked, me in particular, product management is a term that has gotten a little bit of popularity. It was a topic that we discussed several times throughout the paper. As Michael said, we're really trying to focus on that service end of things and trying to map things a little bit more toward that ECAR, the service offering term, for instance, and the service, the business value. That said, we did talk about putting a line in there about product management. We didn't have consensus on what that term might mean in the scope of this paper, and so we just opted not to talk about it really at length at all, just because it's poorly defined. I think there's actually a footnote in there, something to the effect of, we don't really have agreement on what this says, so we're just not going to really address this here. That said, in our workshops that we've done around this, I have equated product management to service offering management, and we're moving away from that term product management, which connotes a corporate business kind of mentality. There's a different side of things. They have different drivers than we do in higher ed. We're really more IT service offering and service management, not about the P&L and the product development side, which was usually what you find in traditional product management in the corporate world.
I have to say, Chaz, as being part of the revision 2 of the service catalog working group, you've kind of left us with that dilemma about talking about products in our service catalog. So I just want to thank you for that.
You're welcome.
All right, David Duckett from Virginia Tech is asking, for the service ownership paper, were there discussions about service ownership outside of IT, perhaps using perhaps the use of terms customer instead? Did you have any discussions about product owners versus service owners? Any distinctions here? You kind of answered a bit of that. Is there anything specific to what he's asking that you can address?
The word customer, and we debated what's the right word to use in our paper. I believe we did settle on the word customer, I think. Is that right? It's been a little while since I reviewed that part of the notes, but we discussed partner, we discussed users, we discussed lots of different things there. And there are problems with all of those terms, and every one of our institutions seemed to disagree on or have a different perspective on what they used. So we just said, we all understand what we're talking about, I think. Let's just kind of leave it out there and let people decide what they want to use. Does that answer the question?
Dave, we have a chance to ask another question on the Q&A. We have one more question in the Q&A, and I remind folks, just go ahead and type your questions, anything about the papers you want to ask. Yeah, David's saying that makes sense to him. So, all right, so Brian Stengel is asking, while this would maybe more of an implementation question, did the group consider or discuss the dynamics of service ownership assignments to senior leadership positions? Sounds like an alignment of roles to job titles. I've sometimes heard of CIOs referring to themselves as change champions, but would an old line VP of infrastructure, for example, embrace a service owner type role while still having legacy responsibilities? Obviously, senior levels need to be on board, but are they better left to do what they've been doing? Thoughts?
Hi, this is Leeds. I'm going to be very consulty about this and say it depends, but then I'll say what it probably depends on. It might depend in part on the size of the organization and where you are in the journey, meaning that here, our senior leadership are the business service owners, right? But that's really at the senior leadership level. So for us, it is very aligned at that level. I think for us, we're large enough so that, the people that are carrying out kind of those leadership functions are more focused on like the strategy pieces, whereas we have our service offering owners who are a little bit more tactical than that. And so I think for smaller organizations, you might have the same person who is being a senior leader who owns a service offering and may even manage a service offering. So I think there's a lot of depends in terms of your org structure and maturity.
I was going to say, this is one area that we did debate more vigorously, I think, than maybe some of the others, is whether the role should be baked into the definition. We excluded the role and the titles from that, but we all had very different perspectives on this one as well. At Notre Dame, we have 3 principles that we're using for assigning service owners. Number 1, they should be managers unless we make a deliberate exception. They should be part of central IT unless we make a deliberate exception. And that reason is because of for the purpose of accountability. If we abdicate responsibility for an IT service to the libraries that is not part of our organization, we're still accountable for IT services on campus, whether or not it's something that they're running or we're not. We can never just say, well, it's not my problem, they do their own thing. They still look to our CIO for leadership of IT across campus. And then the third one, and this is the most important one, is that it should not be a senior director. because our senior directors are already too busy, too in demand, and too focused at a level above where we believe our service owners should be. So the service owner is a strategic role, but we have 50 to 60 services, and we have somewhere between 7 and 10 senior director kind of roles out there. Of all of the people, we have 3 senior directors who are scheduled to attend the trainings. Not a single one of them actually can attend a training because their schedules simply don't allow it. So that isn't to say that the service owner or that the service owners have all of this authority, that we're giving to them. It's not a role that's about authority. It's about responsibility, and authority is in higher ed all about consensus. Remember, a 30-to-1 vote is a tie. So you still have to do your due diligence, work with your stakeholders, all of that. So we felt that in our institution that putting it at the senior director didn't give it weight necessarily. It just took away the resource to actually be actively involved with the ownership of the service. But we debated that a lot, so that's us, not everybody.
Any thoughts or discussion about what may come next? Have any of you been approached by Karen about another paper? So what does the future hold?
I mean, I would love to know what my future holds, but I certainly don't.
I got a crystal ball I can loan you.
I would say, like, just from my personal, like, I think it'd be interesting to explore what does it mean to mature your change management process. I think there's probably a lot more opportunity for measuring a change management process. What does that look like? How do you know if it's doing what you want it to do? And then maybe we even alluded to it. How do you get leadership buy-in, right? Because in both of these areas, I think change management or service ownership, you've got to have that champion, that executive champion to help these concepts become really adopted by the organization. So.
Yeah, and maybe taking a step back from that question and ask, is this something that I do again? My answer to that would be yes. I mean, for me, it was a good experience. Getting to work with other people, seeing how others are doing change management. It was a fun experience.
And to add to that, it was really a good learning experience as well to hear how other people have done it and compare to what you do and pick up little tidbits that help you improve your world.
Yeah, personally, I can't speak highly enough of the relationship I've formed through this community and just spinning up these ad hoc working groups, even just informally, working with folks on adoption, IT service management adoption has been very valuable to see what people are doing with training around, how their change management process or service ownership process. So yeah, these relationships are very much invaluable. We have time for additional questions. Maybe another final question. While you're thinking about it, I will ask a question here. So one of the questions is, where do I start to implement change or service ownership? If there's one thing I can do to get started, what would that be?
What are your biggest pain points by not having it, right? And I don't mean to sound trite with that, but it's, I always think it's good to, when you're looking at doing any type of continual service improvement, it's focusing on where you have pain. Then if you're solving something, then your organization is going to have more patience, and as you implement change, it's going to be more easily absorbed than if you're just doing it to make change. So I'd really kind of start with, what are your biggest pain points? And if, for example, they're more on the strategy side, then you take a look at some of the strategy items, but if you have, operational challenges, then, I might be looking more toward my, my service structure and my support structure.
One thing that I would say, a lot of times we think about we're going to start doing this whole new thing. I think if you took a step back and really looked at your organization, you'd find that you have a lot of the elements in place already. And so it's just kind of assessing what you have, and then deciding where you want to go from there. Kind of a core principle is start with what you've got.
That's one of the 9 ITIL guiding principles. So excellent. All right. Well, so a question just popped in. So it's from Ann Gurwitz. She's asking, how do you approach communication channels for change management, given the various audiences that need to be notified in a higher ed environment? Great question, Ann.
I think when we were at the change management group was talking about communication, I do think there is it varied greatly on how the changes are communicated to the stakeholders. I think it comes down to, are there dedicated communication resources within your organization or not? For me personally at UNC Charlotte, we do have a dedicated communicator, so we've been able to thoughtfully implement kind of communication around change management. But it did vary greatly.
Just typing in a resource in the chat window. There was a webinar last year around communicating IT changes, and just a preview, we're setting up another follow-up webinar around communicating IT service changes, so stay tuned for that. All right, well, if there aren't any other questions or any final thoughts from our panelists?
Mitch, I just see that Danny asked, how would each of you rate your organization's ITSM maturity?
Thank you for catching.
So, I think personally I'd rate ours are 2 or 3, for my organization, for our culture, which you've got to take into account. We have a fairly simple process, but we do follow that process as best as possible. We do not have a dedicated ITSM team, nor do we have a dedicated IT change manager. So I think we could grow, but I think we're at where we need to be right now for our organization.
And actually, it looks like I've missed another question in the Q&A. Is Amit was asking about, unless you answered it already, how on average how big or how many people are full-time dedicated to the change advisory board? And even I'll go further, even to how many change managers do you have, or analysts, or do you have a change process owner?
So this is Craig. We have 2 people that are change managers at the University of Utah. The CAB is just one of the responsibilities in terms of who participates in CAB. We expect all the IT managers to participate. We have a 1-hour meeting once a week. And our CAB is really open to anybody at the university that wants to be part of it. It probably takes the change managers 2 to 3 hours a week prepping for the meeting, and then an hour at the meeting itself.
Like Craig, we have 1 person dedicated to being change manager, and the CAB is made up of a core group of people, and that's only part of their responsibility, similar to what Craig had. We do allow observers, so in addition to that core group.
All right, thank you so much. I think I might have missed a question or 2, but from the audience that typed in the chat window. If I did, the panelists have offered their email contact. Feel free to email them or email me afterwards, and we'll make sure we get you the answers to your questions. All right, so thank you so much, panelists, for participating in this panel today. And to the audience, we're always looking for fresh ideas. So if you have an idea for a webinar or a desire to present, please contact myself, mpouts@usc.edu. A reminder that the transcripts and recording will be available within 5 business days on the ITSM Google site. To view a list of upcoming events and past recordings and other great resources, as you saw in the chat window, there's a lot more there on the Google site. Please visit it. And the address is located in our signature there. It's at sites.google.com. Just search for EDUCAUSE ITSM. And with that, we'll end it. Thank you so much to the panelists, and thank you so much for you that attended. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks, Mitch.